I want to really zero in on one important nuance. Since we're here today on this particular call to talk a lot about learning about our customers by way of our employees, I thought it might make sense to talk for a moment about something that my team and I deeply believe in. And it goes back to I guess it was originally a Harvard Business Review magazine article a lot of years ago called Putting the Service Profit Chain to Work. And if you've not heard of the concept of the service profit chain, think of the work that many of us do in the world of customer experience today. And I'm going to challenge you with a rhetorical question of how could you have a great CX outcome with a subpar EX? And so that article in the magazine made a point that said all good customer experience outcomes have a natural link back to EX, because if your employees are disengaged and disingenuous in their roles and in their work style, there's no way they're going to create those good outcomes that you're looking for. And since there's clearly a connection that I can talk about between customer outcomes, customer experience, and now employee experience and employee engagement, these things will all start to blend together. And that was one of the theses of the article in the magazine. Question Pro, from a tool standpoint, makes it possible to start to not just solicit feedback from your customers appropriately, but you could also go out and talk to your employees at scale with the same platform and be able to bring in information, because you're going to start to cross-analyze and cross-mesh this information in a way that gives you an interesting point of view. Imagine like a data visualization, a chart, if you will, like a spider chart of your CX outcomes overlaid with your EX outcomes. There's an interesting story that tends to be in the margins, which is sometimes if you ask your employees, how do you think your customers are doing? You're going to have a uniquely different answer than if you ask your customers, how are you doing? Mm-hmm. Sometimes your employees say, oh, we're terrible at our work. People hate us. Other people say, oh, we're rock stars. And it turns out people think differently. So it's that disconnect. We often disconnect, whether we rate ourselves too highly or too low to be an accurate read on the customers. But it's so by cross-analyzing the two, you start to see some interesting insights. And Question Pro as a platform enables us to not just get the voice of the customer, but the voice of the employee also, and do just that. So with that, thank you for the opportunity to ride along with this esteemed panel today and to be part of the conversation, and for having a chance to introduce Question Pro to you guys. I want to encourage anybody on the call to go to questionpro.com and just check us out. You'll see a lot about us out on the web. Thanks a lot, guys.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, for that introduction. And I'm glad you mentioned service profit chain, because that's really a key element, and it has some longevity to it. That started in 1997. Yep. And I think it solidifies this relationship as you look at the service profit chain between employees and customers, which leads to profitable growth. And of course, you don't start at profitable growth and have that as your primary goal. You start with all those other elements. And I think it's a really important one and very fundamental to CX, and is also part of the CX Pro curriculum, I might say, and the book. Something that we'd like to do here at the beginning of each of these episodes is we'd like to run a poll. And I think it looks like we have the poll up on screen right now. So if you were to scan that QR code with your phone, as I'm doing now, it would go right to the poll, and you type in that number, that code that you see there, and you'll get the poll questions. Scott, if you're driving, it may be hard for you to do that. So
Hey, Karl, I'm in park, hands-free, totally hands-free.
Oh, there you go. Okay, I see some folks coming in there now. This is good. And we have the music to go along with it. Here we go. So the question is, how best could employee feedback enhance your customer experience strategy? And there's several choices there. Wow, that's an interesting, are we done with the poll here? It looks like everybody's in here. Yeah. I don't know. Internal access to customer insights, which means understanding customers' needs, actions, behaviors for improved sales and engagement. That seems to get the most votes. And the next one is fosters empowerment in innovation, foster a culture of contribution, innovation among employees. Probably not surprising to see those two kind of rise to the top here. So with that, let us move on to my guest here today, Patty Saltis.
Hi, Karl. Hi, Mark. Nice to see both of you.
Patty and I were originally connected through the CXPA, where a lot of connections are made. And I've gotten to know Patty more through our mutual interest in customer experience over the last several years. Patty is a senior customer experience manager with Upwork. Before that, she had over 3 decades of experience as a practitioner in retail, a consultant, an analyst. Patty started her career listening to the voice of the employee, learning more about elevating customer experiences. And over the years, the more she listened to the voice of the employee, the more she found the benefits for the customer team and organization. Patty also found significant financial benefits with more profitable sales and lower expenses, especially in human resources. Patty, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be here. And I have to add that I got to know Mark, too, through the CXPA. We worked together on the Book of Knowledge.
That's right. That was fun.
Mm-hmm.
There you go. See, lots
it was long.
It was long and fun.
Yeah.
So, Patty, why don't we start off by having you give us a brief introduction to yourself beyond what I've said here and the work you're doing at Upwork, which is fairly new.
I think you've covered most of it, Karl. The thing that I would add to that is just that I was very young in my career when I discovered customer experience. I didn't know what it was called. I didn't know there was a name for it. I didn't know there was a name for customer journey. Like, I didn't know any of that stuff. I just figured out at like I said, a very young age, how important it was. And it just seemed innate to me to figure out who your customer was, because if there's no customer, there's no business. So I remember, I'll tell you just a little quick story about that. And when I had just turned 2, I was working for Lord & Taylor in the Washington, D.C. area, and I became a department manager for them, an area called Moderate Sportswear. And I had these 2 amazing sales associates named Kareen and Gloria. And I was standing there on the selling floor early one morning before the store opened, and nobody else was around. And I was standing there just looking at racks of clothes and walls of clothes. And I just thought to myself, who buys this? What do they do with it when they buy it? Why are they going to come back and buy more? And, one question kind of got into another and another and another. And I was standing there with my little smarty pants college degree, and I realized I didn't know any of that information. So my 2 sales associates, and that on paper worked for me, reality is I worked for them. They educated me on the customer, and they taught me about the customer. And that was my initial beginning into it. And this was back in actually November of 1987. So it was quite, the education went on for several months, but it was really enlightening to me to learn that piece. And I just have taken it with me the whole way through. And I was very excited to find the CXPA and to find other people who thought the same way that I did, that without your business, without your customer, your business just doesn't exist. And you need all these elements inside a customer experience in order to make this work. So I don't ever look at customer experience as being to me, customer experience is nothing more than a necessity in a business. Like, why would you not pay attention to your customer?
That's a really good question. Why would you not?
I have no idea.
So let me ask you this question here. This is something that I've been thinking about lately, and that is that we're a society that is enamored with cutting edge technology and attracted to the latest and greatest shiny object. And of course, artificial intelligence is one of the most recent shiny objects to emerge with all sorts of, I say, promises and pitfalls that go along with it. And that shiny object syndrome seems to compete with things less dramatic and subtle, perhaps as employee feedback. So how do you get an organization to want to pay attention to things that are apparently not as cutting edge as that?
I think that is a really good question, Karl. That a lot myself, and I think that we're all like little mama birds sometimes and just attracted to what's the latest and greatest thing that came out. I mean, I can just start rattling off a list of things. In the last couple of years, we've heard a lot about the metaverse. Now we're on to Gen AI. Like it'll be something, and we've heard about NFTs. It'll like there'll be something else that'll come next, without a doubt. And I just think that there's some business methods that are tried and true that we need to hold on to and really keep a focus on order to be successful in what we do. And I'll tell you, in my retail days, and it was 27 long years that I lived in the retail world and worked in stores. So I was constantly on that front line. And but my specialty was going into dysfunctional businesses and turning them into thriving profit centers. And the one principle that I took with me for 27 long years that's worked every single solitary time was to build a customer-centric culture. It was tried and true. It never failed. And you kind of touched on this in the beginning, but I have to say, in the end, I turned these dysfunctional businesses with the team, and that was my internal team and my external partners in our corporate areas. But I did it. We did it, and we produced CSAT. We produced NPS. And we produced the best employee engagement results. I had the lowest turnover in the company. And then beyond that, getting into the actual financial metrics in the organization, constant increase in revenue that was flowing through, lower selling costs, like one of the highest gross margins in the organization. And then we were able to send our contribution back to the company and really contribute into that EBITDA number for the organization. So this wasn't something that I looked at and thought about it as, this is going to make people feel good. For me, this was about how am I going to drive to a business result? And, it was a business result that did have that feel good component in it. So it was literally a win piece. So I don't think that when you start looking at these shiny objects that are out there, because like I said, they're just going to keep coming. And I think they're going to keep coming at us even faster. You have to look at what are those principles you're holding on to and how are you going to hold on to them nice and tight? And how are you going to keep CX as part of that business strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I can, again, relate to that. I mean, it came out of the B2B world as opposed to the retail B2C world. How do you think that gathering voice of the employee in that fashion, frontline employees, is any different in B2B versus B2C? How would you?
I think there's definite in every organization and in different parts of organizations. I think there's going to be differences. I don't think there's a one-stop shop approach inside of these things, but it all stems from that employee engagement piece. And it's interesting because Mark, you mentioned the Harvard Business Review article. I was just reading another one that's an oldie but a goodie recently, and it was it's called How the Employee Experience Impacts Your Bottom Line. And that article talked about they went out and they looked into, particularly in stores, and they looked at these organizations and they looked at where the average employee experience was inside the organization. And when it was in the bottom quartile, what were their results? And then when it moved into the top quartile, what they found is that these stores were able to increase their sales and their profit by 50%. I think that says an awful lot. And the other thing that I always think says an awful lot about using CX principles, and when you use CX principles, it has to be hand in hand with EX principles, which means you have to have that VOE piece inside of it. You look at the results on the ACSI, the American Customer Satisfaction Index. You look at results that come from the Watermark Consulting Report that John, and I never say his last name right, Picoult does. And then you look at the Fredzy, what Fred Reichheld puts out there. All of them consistently have higher results than the market, typically higher than Vanguard. And so the statistics are out there that say that CX is important. The statistics are out there that say EX is important. The statistics are out there that say VOE is important. So whether you're in B2B or B2C, it's just something that you need to make part of your process. And if you're nascent in it, then you've got to figure out a way to get that part going and just keep iterating the process so that you do become really fluent in it, and that you do build this into being part of your business.
Yeah, and when I'm saying B2B versus B2C, it also occurs to me that there's large companies and small companies. So what can work in sometimes really readily in small organizations are very hard in larger organizations, and scaling up successes that you've had maybe at the start of an organization, but as it grows, those things can kind of get a little bit more in the distance here. How do you keep that going? I mean, I can share an example, but I want to hear from you since you're my guest here and it's not about me. And also these other folks that are on the line here, I want to give them a chance to chime in here. But how do you manage that when the organization gets large, and where again it comes back to this, focusing on shiny objects, but you get all these other, channels of feedback from customers, and the normal channels that we all talk about are, surveys and focus groups and other things like that. But how do you keep that alive at that getting that frontline feedback?
I think, well, I'm going to start with what you just ended with there, Karl, and that is that frontline feedback is really important, but so is feedback from every other person in the organization. VOE is not just about getting that frontline feedback. VOE is about getting it from throughout the organization and tying that all together. And I have some more little fun facts that I want to share, and that is how important this is. Because when employees feel that they're being heard, they become more engaged. And when they become more engaged, turnover becomes less, productivity goes up, innovation becomes greater. And all of those things, ultimately, they save companies like so much money depending on the size of the organization. Gallup had Gallup released some research about a year and a half ago. And inside the research, they said that turnover in an organization, one person's turnover costs the organization anywhere between 50% and 200% of that person's salary. That's an insane number when you start to multiply that out. So I think that it's something that's really important to keep your eye on the prize with everyone in the organization and not just in the frontline pieces. Now, to go back and address the other thing that you asked me, and that's about the difference between smaller organizations and larger organizations. I kind of don't buy that it gets that much harder, because you have more people inside an organization doesn't necessarily mean this should be any harder. It might be more difficult to roll out the initiative throughout the entire organization, and that might take a little bit more time. But it's funny because when I did work in retail, we had a saying, small store, small problems. And I used to think that was true until I worked in a small store, and there was no such thing as a small problem. We had just as many problems as we did when I worked in the larger stores. The big difference was that in the larger stores, you had more people that could handle that kind of thing. And in the smaller stores, you were just wearing more and more and more hats, trying to get things done. So I do think it's possible. I think it's just breaking it down. And maybe it's in the larger organization, it's not something that becomes initially an initiative that rolls out through 10,000 plus people. That would be something really difficult to undertake. But, breaking that down into chewable bits and pieces, that can be something that can certainly get out there. I mean, these people that are in smaller organizations, they're doing 19 different things every minute of every day. And so I think it can be just as difficult in that case. And it's just a matter of the leadership prioritizing this, saying this is important, and it's that investment back into their teams.
So we have some questions coming in here. I've got one from Greg Melia, who asks, what are some examples of companies leveraging employee listening to improve customer experience?
Hi, Greg. I just have to say hi to you first. How are you? Hope everything is going well. I do have some examples of companies that have really leveraged it well. And I'm going to talk first about Apple, because Apple has created an organization that really leverages employee experience, and they really get in there and they leverage that VOE. And I don't know how many of you have been to an Apple store recently, but you walk into an Apple store and you ask their employees, they know exactly what NPS is. I know this because I've done it. And I did. I've done it several times, actually, just because I didn't want to say, okay, statistically it's insignificant to try it once. But gosh, I've done it many times. And I've read about other people who've done it. That's where I got the idea from. I didn't think of this myself. But, they know it and they understand it. And they just really provide that constant flow of communication between the front lines, the senior leaders, and all the other people that are inside the organization. And I think that really makes a difference. I can tell you in the role that I'm doing now at Upwork, and just so everybody knows, I'm on day 7 in my new job. So it's a new position. But my role was just added to the organization because they do want to get a better feel for what the customer is going through and make sure that our product managers really understand what it is the customer needs. And so I think that when you start layering those pieces into organizations, I think it makes a difference. But Apple's a really, really good example of that. You look at what's happened inside of Airbnb. That's another place where they've really looked at their CX teams. They've really looked at their data scientists. And so I'm not talking about, it's Airbnb. This is something that you're doing online for most often. But they've really looked inside the organization and have figured out how to get those actionable insights permeated throughout the organization. Now, that's listening to the CX team inside the Airbnb. That's listening to the data scientists inside Airbnb. So that's a really good example of voice of the employee that now is permeating throughout the organization. And I read something about Airbnb recently, and they went from 4.1 million users in 2019, and they were projected to hit 45.6 million users in 2022. That's more than twice as many users in 3 years. That's crazy. So there's some examples right there of where people are using this and where they're actually seeing a lot of success with it.
You mentioned something intriguing at the beginning of this. You said where everybody knew what NPS meant, which is in some ways these days is a double-edged sword, right? Because more people know what it is, they know how to react to the question when they're asked it.
Oh my God, doesn't it crack you up when you're sitting at a dinner party and somebody asks what you do and you say customer experience, and then you say, like somehow NPS will come up and they all know what it is.
Yeah.
Like the average person, you say, the question that's on the survey that asks if you're likely to recommend, they're like, oh yeah, like everybody knows what it is now.
Now I want to follow up because you mentioned the word data analytics, and I want to ask this question here, and we get to some of the other ones here. In a world where businesses have so much access to data, what makes employee feedback? How does it stand out as a unique source of insights? And how does it complement the data-driven approaches? Because obviously this isn't necessarily a data-driven approach, at least not the way I think about it. But how would you answer that?
Well, first of all, I think it's really important because there's a research paper from Alita that's out. And in the research paper, they said that 25% of customers feel unheard, 25% of customers feel unheard, and that 80% of customers are no longer coming back. That is a huge number that's at risk. Qualtrics came out about a year and a half ago and said there's $1.9 trillion in commerce in the United States, just in the US, that's at risk because of poor customer experience. So, these are big things that kind of pull that piece out. Forrester came out and said that and they did a survey amongst many organizations. 19% of them said VOC was firmly embedded in their organization, and only 23% of them believed that VOC was well defined in their organization. So these are big telling numbers that are out there that tell you how important this is to really get into and to really dive into the VOC and to get into the VOE. And there's so much data that's out there on both of them that it becomes really important that inside your systems and your structures, you have the data analytics teams and the data scientists and things like that. And then you've got somebody from the CX world that's there to interpret that data and move it into something. And this is what I'm going to say next is really important, but move it into some form of storytelling so that the product managers can understand, so that the other leaders in the organization can understand, so that the financial people can understand. But that storytelling piece is just crucial. So you need to move that information along on through the systems. You need people inside your organizations that are trained to sit down and talk to employees and to get their feedback. Once again, not just on the front line, but throughout the entire organization. And they can work and coexist very nicely with the data scientists, with the CX teams. It could be the CX teams that are doing this. It could be an HR team that's doing this. It doesn't matter necessarily where they are. What matters is the partnerships that they have. So really getting in there and pulling that information together. And like I said, this storytelling piece is just crucial, because if you do a data dump on somebody, I'm going to wish you lots of luck, because it's not going to go anywhere.
Yeah. No, I learned that well when putting together data-rich reports versus storyboard reports, and the different effects those two can have. You know, there's certain people who really want that, you know, techie data stuff here, but to get the masses to understand this, especially in leadership who have shorter attention spans, the storytelling is real key here.
Hey, Karl, can I jump in for a second about that?
Sure.
Just to add a layer to what Patty and you were talking about. You know, when we're talking about data and the front lines and collecting VOE to derive VOC, it's interesting, but, you know, we want to not lose sight of the fact that there's two types of data, right? There's quantitative data and qualitative data. And with regard, and both are considered obviously valid data. An interesting story that I'll share goes back a lot of years, though. It's sort of an old story, but a goodie, because I had the privilege of having my fingerprints on this stuff. If you guys know the retailer Best Buy, you know, the electronics store, Best Buy at least used to have, and I think they may still, they created something, an online employee portal, a community in a portal called the Blue Shirt Nation, because they all wore those blue polo shirts at Best Buy, right? So there's something called Blue Shirt Nation, which was only open to the retail staff and their leadership. And if they heard anything from a customer, you know, when they're at a store serving a customer, and customer said something, you know, your inventory about this item is bad, or your availability or the warranty or whatever, they make a note of it on their cell phone. And it goes into this community where other employees can access the data in the format of a story and say, you know, enough. And then they kind of that upvote, downvote, kind of like a Reddit kind of voting situation where certain feedback bubbled up and others didn't. And the reason that was really interesting, and I'm going to use this as a contrast point to what you guys are talking about, you know, it's sort of a danger zone for me if frontline employees fixate on scores, because then they learn how to manipulate and game them. And even Apple, you know, would learn how to manipulate their score at the front line. And so by taking the pressure of the score out of the equation, you take away the nonsense behaviors like we all have seen in car dealerships when people are begging for 5s out of 5s, right? You know, it's nonsense. But if you just put the qualitative in front of people, the stories, it engages them and creates an emotion where they're committed to solving the problem. And if you could think at that level, at the qualitative storytelling, take the scores and put them aside level and have it be from the voice of the employee in to one another, kind of peer-to-peer sharing, still rich with data that you can mine and learn from and propagate out into the business. But at the same time, you're not fixating on, oh, my store is a 73 and my guy down the road is a 76, so why can't I beat them? Right? It's not as punishing around competitiveness and scores, and just more about serving one another and serving the customer.
No, good point, Mark. Thanks.
I just want to jump in on what Mark was saying there, because I got really excited when you started talking about qualitative and quantitative data, the qual and quants that are out there with this. Mm-hmm. And that is, that's this right here. To me, there's a third kind of data that's out there, and that's the emotional data. Mm-hmm. And that's what you can get out of your VOE a lot of times. You can hear, because most of the time you're talking to your employees, and you can hear when they get excited about something and when they become very passionate about something. And, you know, that's really more for your team members that are, not frontline oriented, but all your support levels and things like that. You can see what it is they're doing. You can really use a lot of the great active listening skills in those cases right there. And the other part of it is then when you start getting into your frontline teams, whether you're talking to your customer success teams, you're talking to your account managers, you're talking to your sales teams, whatever, your contact centers, whatever it is, they can tell you the emotion that you can hear, that they can hear coming from the customers. And they can say, the customer might have said this on the survey, but let me tell you what they really meant. And like that can give you so much clarity on what is important and what isn't important. So I'm so, like, Mark, I got so excited when you brought that up. But I do think that that's I do think that emotion is another important data piece to consider in this. And that is why VOE becomes so important. And you've got to hear what your teams have to say and how they have to say it.
And make them hear heard for it so that they continue to share it.
Mm-hmm.
Success, effort, and emotion, that three-legged stool. Yep. I want to get to some questions that come in here. Beth Miller has asked the question, how to coach customer service managers to train their teams to share feedback in a form that will be more impactful and actionable by product. Example, get more info from customers to be able to supply the following. What are the issues for customers? How is it disrupting their business? I don't know if that kind of makes is clear to you here, but it's how do you coach managers to train their teams to share the feedback in the form?
The first thing you have to do is put together the key part here is coaching the customer service managers. Like that's the key right there to all of this, because our customer service managers are held accountable for a number of statistics, including how quickly they can resolve a problem. And so I think that's something that you really have to take a look at. I mean, we all know in most contact centers, there's a time frame on where, how long they can talk with someone. That's where Zappos came in and kind of broke the ceiling on that one and said, we want to talk to people, like, let's keep talking. But I do think that this whole piece on coaching the customer service managers and giving them the leadership skills that they need to be able to develop the right culture inside their customer service areas. Teach them how to listen, teach them how to active listen, teach them how to ask the right questions, teach them how to balance out. And I mean, this is a really tricky thing. How do you balance out how much time you spend talking about somebody's personal life versus how much time do you spend talking to somebody about what they need to accomplish at work? Because you want to make them feel like they're important, but you can't spend your whole day talking about what they had for dinner last night. And there's some point in time where you've got to get into the business of what you're doing. So that's a very fine line that people that are in these customer service managers, like, they need to learn how to walk that line. So I just think, in my opinion, it falls all into how are you coaching your customer service managers? What kind of leadership do they have? What are they being held accountable to? What are the people on the team being held accountable to? The people on the team, do they have all on their performance reviews? Is it all objective, or is there some subjective parts about how they're contributing back, about what they're doing for innovation, about how they're sharing things? So there's a lot of different layers I think you can peel back on this one, but still, for me, in the very core of all of this, it comes down to how are you coaching your customer service managers and what are they being held accountable for?
Okay, well, we have a bunch of questions coming in here. I hope you don't mind, Patty.
No, that's okay. I can answer them.
So there's some, success, effort, and emotion. Yep. The mantra. Oh, yes. So we had a question here about how do you foster a culture of employee experience? I mean, it sounds like a very broad question. How do you foster a culture of employee experience?
That is a very, very big question. And that is, you can read the CXPA Book of Knowledge, and there's a section in there on culture and accountability. And I am very familiar with that section, as is Mark, because we both were writers on that section. But I would, in all honesty, I would encourage you to take a look at that section in the CXPA Book of Knowledge. It's really well done. It's written by practitioners and a couple consultants, but a lot of really, really great information inside of there. So definitely take a look at that. But aside from that, I mean, how do you foster a culture of gosh, it's just such a big question because there's so many pieces to it. And I think the first piece of it is to have an inclusionary type of environment. It all depends on the culture that you're setting and what the leaders inside the organization. And we say this all the time in CX, and I don't think it ever becomes something that cannot not be said, and it has to be said each time, but it comes from the top. So it definitely, that comes from the top, but a lot of is and everything, they come from the bottom. So you have to have that tops down approach in promoting throughout the organization how important employee experience is. But in doing that, you need things to funnel up from the bottom, and you need to provide that culture where those things are going to really be genuinely listened to. I mean, we've all had jobs in our lives where we felt really valued, and we've had jobs in our lives where you just don't feel any value at all. So I think that, gosh, I wish there was a snap quick answer to this question. I don't feel like there is. I don't know, Karl and Mark, if you want to add something to it, but I don't have that snappy quick 1, 2, 3 kind of answer for that question.
I would add one thing, and that's just make it a safe place to behave a certain way. Don't punish for the feedback. Make people make people be okay that good news is good, bad news is good. And you want them to be willing to share it and engage in it and think through it and address it without the fear of, oh my God, what's going to happen to me if I share that or work on that or get involved in that. And I think so the idea of kind of psychological safety plays a huge role in that. But again, I also think that it comes down to sharing tribal knowledge with one another, especially in the context, going back a question to the customer service question. Right now, these teams, these customer service teams, whether they be virtual now and distributed or in a physical call center in some places, they have stand-up meetings every morning. They got stand-up meetings every afternoon amongst their teams. Share stories with each other. Tell somebody about a call that you handled today that it went well, and have that story have a moral and learn from it and take it and do something about it. And I think just this tribal knowledge sharing in a safe place is a foundation of a good, strong culture that would then allow us to to better engage, better put ourselves, invest in ourselves and how we put ourselves into the customer experience and what's happening around us. And to allow us, Patty, going full circle to a comment you made earlier, where you alluded to this, to allow us at work to be our best selves. Mm-hmm. And when we're our best selves, we really engage and we really work hard and we really, do the right thing for our customers and for our coworkers. And I think good things all start to happen when that happens. But it all comes back to being safe.
I agree with you completely on that, Mark. And, being our best selves at work and giving that psychological safety, part of that is, quite frankly, getting rid of the bad seeds.
Yep.
So Patty, we've had another question come in here, which is a rather broad one here. It says, how do you achieve business growth through customer experience? And all I could think of was, Mark, well, you brought it up, the service profit chain. That really explains it. That spells it all out, how you do that. But do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, here's a really easy one: retention and referrals. It's just like the biggest no-brainer of all. If you can boost your retention and boost your referrals, your marketing budget goes way down. Your salespeople's jobs get a whole lot easier. You're starting then to build products and services that people actually want inside the organization. Your innovation is going to flourish. I mean, it ties right back into it. And I'm going to go back to my retail days on it, because I didn't grow up in customer experience. I grew up in a business, and I grew up running businesses and did it for a really long time. And like I said in the very beginning, I didn't know what CX was for like most of my retail career, to be honest. And but I used CX principles in everything I did, but they were all tied to a metric. Like everything went back to, what am I doing to try and increase sales and profitability inside of my store? Now, how did I provide a great environment with that for my sales associates and my support teams? I mean, I had 200 plus of them inside of some of my stores. So that's a lot of people inside of just one building. How did I do it for my customers and make them feel that way? All of those pieces right there, they went back to, how am I increasing sales and profitability? And I kind of mentioned some of these metrics in the beginning, but from just a numerical standpoint, it became about, how am I driving gross margin? How am I driving profitable selling? How am I keeping my selling cost low? How am I spending my marketing budget so that I'm getting a 60-to-1 ROI? Like, how am I doing all of those things and hitting these financial metrics? And I did it because I provided a great employee experience and a great customer experience. And it was just, to me, it was just very simple. And I think it gets highly overcomplicated sometimes. And I know there's other variables that people can say, well, this caused an increase in revenue. But you have to look at what you're doing and what the contribution is, because there's just the flat out economy that can sometimes give you an increase in revenue. Look what happened with Zoom during COVID. Like, of course they had an increase in revenue. Wouldn't have mattered what they did. It went way up. Look at what happened to Peloton. Their revenues went through the roof, and then they've had some troubles since then. But, there's other factors that can always be flowing into these things, but you have to be cognizant of what you're doing and what metric is it that you're trying out there to push and to drive forward with what you're doing in CX. And when you start with that piece of it, and then you look at, okay, if I'm trying to drive, I'm going back to retention and referrals. If I'm trying to drive retention and referrals, how am I going back and looking at what I'm doing to keep my customers? How am I going back to looking at what I'm doing to make my customers raving fans? And, you start looking at those behaviors, and the answer becomes clear, and you can drive your retention and your referral. You're going to lower your expenses, and you're going to increase your sales.
So, Patty, we're coming up on 40 minutes here right now, but I see a couple of questions here from Jerry Seifert, who is on camera. So, Jerry, would you like to, because there's a couple of good questions here, but I'll let you choose which one of those you want to ask Patty.
I have to choose?
You don't have to. I'm offering you the opportunity.
I'll let Patty choose, because we're running short on time.
Well, one of them here is a challenge question. How would this conversation differ if it were held exclusively with under 40s, who overwhelmingly are the front line now?
Well, it doesn't differ that much. You still want to find out what's important to them. What values do they have? And talk to them about that and find out what that is, and then work from that angle of it. I mean, you can't ever run an organization without finding out what's important to your team members. So I would say for the under 40s, and even for those Gen Zers that are coming up now, find out what's important to them. I mean, it varies obviously from generation to generation, from Z to millennials to Xers to baby boomers. I mean, there's different things that each one of them value, but you need to just dig in and find out what that is. And that's having meaningful conversations. And I'm going to cheat here a little bit, because I saw Scott's question that came in too. And he asked the question about how do companies get away from annual surveys and into continuous learning? I mean, these two things kind of coincide, because it's all about that culture that you're creating. Like Mark mentioned, psychological safety, it's key inside of these organizations. So finding out what matters, building that psychological safety that's there. You can certainly get away from the annual surveys and into continuous learning, and finding out what values people have and what matters to them and what's important to them by talking to them. Like this, I feel like this is just like such an easy thing. Like I almost feel bad saying it out loud, but it's pretty simple. And I'll tell you what I did in my retail days, because I had a pretty tight formula for it that I took with me from store to store. And that is that I had what was called not an open door policy, I had an open floor policy, which meant that I scheduled time on my calendar every single day to be out there on the selling floor or somewhere in my support areas. I was doing trucks with people. I was delivering merchandise to areas. I was not sewing anything in alterations because I'm not good at that, but I was back there working with them. I was running things for them, answering questions. It didn't matter what it was. I just got involved with everything that was there. And that built a lot of that psychological safety that Mark was talking about, because they knew I understood. I took markdowns. I undid boxes. I hauled trash, like cleaned out fitting rooms, like whatever it was, I would be out there with them doing it. So that was part of my open floor policy. And doing that also created time to have conversation with people, find out what matters to them. Going back to Jerry's question, I knew what mattered to my different teams. I knew what mattered to my different generations. I knew what mattered to my different genders. I knew what mattered to my different nationalities. Like I could break all that down because I was out there working with them all the time on these different things. We had a clear communication system in place between newsletters, daily meetings, things we posted throughout the store. We used the back door bathroom stalls to post important information because we knew that we had a captive audience at that point in time. We knew we made sure that we had consistent communication messaging that we were sharing from our leadership teams out into the rest of the organization. And then the other thing that we did, and I did this consistently, twice a month, there was an employee discussion group. And you were invited to the employee discussion group if you had either a birthday or a company anniversary in that month. If they fell in the same month, I'm really sorry, but you only got one invitation. You could come to both sessions if you wanted, but you got one. But these sessions, I got a really good turnout inside of them. And because of that open floor policy that I had, that trust network was already in place. And I started every session off saying the exact same thing. You are in a place of trust, and what you say personally will not be repeated. It will be all aggregated into a set of comments unless you say something that's really alarming, and then I have to bring that up. But otherwise, we're just going to sit here and have a conversation, and you're going to tell me what's on your minds. There were a few times where I would go in and have something on my mind where we were going through change management or something like that, and I would talk about that piece and get their feedback on it. But all of those things just really helped. And then the last thing that I would say that was really helpful was just sheer transparency. Sometimes things came to us corporately and they were just dumber than dirt. I mean, just so dumb. And I could not stand there in front of 200 plus people multiple times in multiple stores and tell people that I thought this was a good idea. And so I was direct and honest about it. And I said, okay, this seems like it's going to be a little challenging to us, but let's figure it out and let's find a better way to do this. And so all of those things conglomerated in, and they helped deal with the people that were in different generations, to Jerry's question. And they also helped to Scott's question, get past that annual survey. And I never, like, my annual surveys were literally the best in in each company I worked in, they were the best. But it was because of all those other pieces that were in place.
So, a little bit, there's almost a segue here because I put a question of my own here for you in the chat.
Uh-oh.
Because we only have a few minutes left here. Could you discuss any ethical considerations related to collecting and utilizing employee feedback for CX enhancement? In other words, how can organizations ensure that the feedback process respects employee privacy and doesn't lead to unintended negative consequences?
Yeah, that's when I was just saying a minute ago and talking about each employee discussion group out and talk about how like I said, that circle of trust was already built. There was a lot of that groundwork that was done prior to those things, but I lived by my word. If somebody said something and I didn't agree with it necessarily, I didn't go to their manager and tell them so-and-so just said this. It was being honest and being truthful and sticking to my word. I mean, I saw leaders over the years that didn't do it, and they didn't have the same kind of cultures and the same kind of environments. And it's because they broke their word. And, I think we learn that when we're very little kids, like, the one thing you have to be able to do is look at yourself in the mirror in the morning and stay true to what you. And I think that had a really big difference to it because, you've got to watch those pieces. And there's certain things, I'm going to stick with my retail days on this one right here because it's just a really applicable example. I worked for Neiman Marcus. We had customers that came into the store and it would be a male coming in with a female, and it may or may not be a spouse. So you had to be very cautious about what you were going to say and what you were going to do. And when you saw the other person's partner back in the store again, or at a social event or out to dinner or anything like that, once again, you were cautious about what you had to say. So you just learn to use discretion and be wise about it. If somebody says something and you have a concern about it, don't go back. This is, to me, it's like 101 stuff, but don't go back and address the group. Go back and sit down and have a conversation with that person. Find out what their real concern is. Why did they bring that up? And talk to them about it. But that ethical piece, I mean, it's everything. I once again love how Mark mentioned psychological safety. It's everything.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Patty. I mean, we're running up here against 50 minutes here for a 45-minute session here, so I want to make sure that we end in time here. I really thank you for your contributions here today. And I think there's a lot of energy around this topic of employee experience and employee feedback. And I'm happy to say that next month's CXBS will feature Rich Dorfman, who is the VP of Customer Experience for Eastern Bank. And this theme will continue on around employee insights and feedback that he has to share, and some concrete examples of how you can tap into those creative ways within your respective organizations. So that'll be on Tuesday, September 19th at the same time here. So thank you so much for being active and engaged here on today's CXBS episode 9, and we'll see you next month for episode 10.
Thank you so much for having me, Karl.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hi, guys.